Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're based. And welcome to the panel on implementing the Global Methane Pledge, tools for measuring progress and securing finance. My name is Santiago Enriquez, and I'm a senior climate change specialist at Abt Associates. It is a pleasure to be here today. This is actually our first side event in this pavilion at COP26. So I really want to thank the Climate Registry and the Climate Action Reserve for the opportunity to present this panel. So this is our agenda for today. It's a relatively straightforward agenda. I will first provide an overview just to frame a little bit about our discussions. Then I'll introduce the three fantastic panelists that we have today. Each of them will deliver their presentation. We'll go into a moderated roundtable discussion, and then we'll open it for Q&A. So let's get started. Next slide, please. So to begin our conversation, I'd like to show or share with you two graphics that I got from the latest IPCC report. The graphic on the right shows the changing global surface temperature between 1850 and 2020. And as you can see, the report finds that global surface average temperatures increased by more than 1 degree centigrade during this period. And then the graphic on the right is telling us the different contributions of different sources of greenhouse gas and other types of climate forcers. And what this graphic is showing is that methane emissions were actually the second largest contributor to net global warming. In fact, it is estimated by the report that about 45% of the net warming caused by anthropogenic factors were caused by methane. So clearly, it's very important to mitigate methane, and I think that's one of the reasons why it has received increasingly attention recently. But the other very important piece that is being emphasized is that methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. So it has a lifespan that is relatively short, about 12 years, and so that means that if we're able to mitigate emissions now, we'll see the effect of those mitigations actions soon. And so the science is really demonstrating that if we want to achieve that 1.5 degrees Celsius target, it's really indispensable to mitigate short-lived climate pollutants, particularly methane. And in addition to those climate benefits, there's a number of other co-benefits that will be achieved through this methane pledge. So the CCAC, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and the United Nations Environment Program estimate that if we achieve that goal, there would also be benefits like preventing more than 200,000 premature deaths, hundreds of thousands of asthma-related emergency rooms visits that would be avoided. And also, we would avoid more than 20 million tons of crop losses a year by 2030. The major sources of methane, as most people probably know, are oil and gas, coal mines, agriculture, and methane from municipal solid waste and landfills. So recognizing that it's very important to mitigate methane emissions, the United States and the European Union announced a pledge and then launched it formally here at COP26 to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030 relative to 2020. I know by now more than 100 countries have signed up to the pledge. And in addition, philanthropists have committed more than 320 million to scale up strategies to mitigate methane. But successfully implementing these actions will require that people are able to track and to verify that those emission reductions are being achieved. And that is something that will require the use of measurement, measurement, reporting, and verification, or MRV systems. And the question is, what are these systems, or what resources or what best practices are already available that can be used to help implement the methane pledge? And how are these MRV systems linked to funding? And these are some of the topics that we plan to go over in the next panel. But let me now try to introduce all of you and go into each of your presentations. So first, we'll have Kait Siegel. Kait is a climate change specialist at Abt Associates with a focus on climate change, air quality, and co-benefits of climate action. She works with the US, federal, state, and international clients to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, primarily methane and other short-lived climate pollutants worldwide. And in addition, she works with clients to understand the non-climate co-benefits of climate action. She holds a master's degree in environmental management from Duke University. Welcome, Kait. Then virtually, we'll have Francisco de la Flor, who is the chair of the group of experts of gas at UNECE. He has more than 30 years of experience in the energy and gas industry and holds several positions at board or ExCom level in a number of European and international organizations. Methane emissions are one of his current areas of interest and specialization, and he's a frequent participant in lecturing and international conferences. His educational background includes chemical engineering and economic sciences and business administration. Welcome, Francisco. And last but certainly not least, we'll have David Waskow. He is the director of the World Resources Institute's International Climate Initiative. He has worked for many years at the intersection of environmental and development issues. And prior to his work at WRI, David directed climate change policy at the development organization Oxfam America, where much of his work focused on the impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities. He has graduate degrees from the University of Chicago and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. His undergraduate degree is from Brown University. Welcome, David. So with that, let me hand it over to Kait for her presentation. Thanks, Kait. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us here bright and early, and thank you, Santiago, for that introduction. My name is Kait Siegel. I'm a climate policy specialist with Santiago at Abt Associates. And for the past few years, I've been working with the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the Global Methane Initiative on mitigating methane emissions and recovering and using the gas for energy specifically in the biogas sector. So when I'm talking about the biogas sector, I'm speaking about three of the main methane sectors, and that's the agriculture sector, which mostly includes agro-residue and manure management in this case, the municipal solid waste, and the municipal wastewater sectors. And we focus here because collectively biogas accounts for approximately 1/5 of global anthropogenic methane emissions, which is a small amount. But as Santiago mentioned in his overview, there are a lot of opportunities in addition to just the climate benefits, but in terms of social and human health benefits from these sectors. So for example, if we're working with smallholder farmers in rural parts of India, where I do much of my work, if they are able to use anaerobic digestion technologies to manage their manure, not only are there climate co-benefits, but they can use that to give themselves some sort of energy security, or if they use it for cooking or heating fuel, they can even get health benefits as they're not using fuel wood or cow patties, which generate a lot of particulate matter when used for heating or cooking in the home. So what are the challenges for accounting for methane emissions and emissions reductions in this sector? Because that's what we're really doing with MRV, right? And I think the biggest challenge is that most people don't consider the biogas sector because it's generally not what we've thought of as a key sector in the past. Or key category, sorry. So when we think about key categories, we think about large emitting sources like the energy sector, or industry, for example. But as we move forward and we get better at estimating our emissions and understanding our emissions reductions from those larger sectors, we have a real opportunity to focus on smaller sectors that we haven't before, but which are growing very rapidly. And biogas is a great example of that, especially methane emissions from landfill sources and organic waste. But we're not collecting information from those projects right now, so there's very little data to work with for MRV purposes. And what we've seen internationally is if there are programs that are collecting data, often within governments, there are many small initiatives. So you might have one that's focused on solid waste, one that's focused with smallholder farmers, some that are focused on larger anaerobic digestion systems in cities, for example. But when you're collecting information in all of those different places, it doesn't necessarily collate really easily. So people could be collecting different types of data in different units. And then you have to find somebody within the government that's willing to put it all together into a single source. And then if they do try to do that, there might be some issues with double counting in those sorts of instances, which is especially important when we start talking about selling credits on carbon markets, because we want to make sure that there is no double counting to make certain that we are exact in our measurements. And finally, through this work, especially in the biogas sector, we noticed that there just wasn't a lot of clear guiding principles for governments that were starting to think about accounting for methane emissions here, and just making it really difficult for anybody who wanted to work in the sector to do so. But if this is a small sector that no one's really focused on before, why should we think about this? Why is MRV important here? And so we thought about 4 main reasons, and I think that this can scale up to MRV more generally, but especially in the biogas sector. And so the first is that MRV will help to develop more robust emissions inventories. So if collected well, the data can be used directly in a national emissions inventory. So for example, in the US, the Environmental Protection Agency, the AgStar program collects anaerobic digester information from farms across the US. And so when they're estimating emissions from that sector, they will conduct state level estimates using animal population data, volatile solid content, and other default data and assumptions. But then on top of that, they take this this database of methane emissions that we have ready and just add it, and making the methane estimates for that category much more robust. Another example of a way you could use the data is to, for example, in the waste sector, get emissions estimates from landfills from continuous monitoring devices and use that to develop region or larger or even smaller estimates of emissions factors, and use those to make your estimates more specific rather than just using defaults that the IPCC might have. Next, we think about how MRV systems can enhance targets in national mitigation commitments. And I believe and hope that David will be speaking to that a little bit later, so I don't want to go over it too much. But just generally, you can't monitor and what you don't measure. And so, yeah, that one's pretty simple. This MRV systems will also make it easier to access funding sources, especially for these small projects that find it hard to get off the ground, giving them access to carbon markets. So one really great example of this is in Chile. They've been working with the government of Canada and have started using blockchain technology and digital MRV systems, which connect the emissions measurements directly to banks that can certify carbon offset credits on the market. And then finally, like I've discussed earlier, these MRV systems can really show how these projects are demonstrating progress towards sustainable development goals. And there are a number that these projects contribute to, not just climate action, health and well-being, water and sanitation, affordable clean energy, and sustainable cities and communities. Next slide. So what tools, we're here to talk about tools and resources. So what tools are available to help in this sector? So as I mentioned before, we found that it was difficult to find some clear guiding principles. And so over the past few years, we've been working with the Environmental Protection Agency to develop a handbook on just that for governments, to give them an idea of what best practices, lessons learned, and other resources exist for MRV in the biogas sector. We're hoping that that's going to be published before the end of the year. And in addition, we've been working on an MRV knowledge hub that goes beyond the biogas sector and will focus first on biogas, as that's where our focus has been the past few years, but then also include tools and resources for oil and gas and coal mine sectors. And the types of information that you can expect to find there are templates for data collection that will help you with your emissions estimation, case studies that have lessons learned from around the world, as well as links to other tools and resources within the GMI network. So thank you so much. I'd love to talk to you all more about MRV in the biogas sector after, if we have a chance. And now I'll pass it on or back to Santiago.
Thank you, Kait. I'm actually just gonna hand it over to Francisco, our virtual participant.
Okay, good morning. Thanks, Santiago. So just a couple of slides just to display the momentum we are living. From one side here, I'm based in Europe, so that the importance of the European legislation, future legislation, is quite relevant. Not only because it's going to have an internal dimension that will oblige the operators and the nationals here in Europe, but also it is announced that an external dimension is also included in this package that could be released, could be just the bill to be prepared for discussion then in the institutions in December. So this will have may have impact in the upstream there's activities so outside the European territory. So that's why it's very important. But at the same time, just to mention, because I'm going to use later on what some three main points. Just Acer as is the agency for regulatory of our regulators in Europe, a white paper on methane, but also the tracker everybody knows from the agency, and this OGMP oil and gas methane partnership that will be also extremely relevant in this war, including of course MRV. Next, please. On the momentum, I would highlight the momentum in public awareness. You already mentioned the pledge, and it was in the title of this event, but also IMEO, just the International Methane Emissions Observatory, that was launched to push the action. Both of them. I mean, the case of the pledge, there's that a lot of information, a lot of let's say mass media dissemination, and then I presume everybody is aware. Then regarding the IMEO. Today, if I'm not wrong, today there will be several events there in Glasgow where just this observatory will be presented and will be just shared with everybody what to do. In the next next slide, please. Sorry, Santiago, because I didn't see your first slide. This is just to pie the emissions. Probably could be said in another way, but here with you mentioned also the main sources: wetlands, agriculture, waste, and but also the energy, gas, coal, and oil. I presume that all sectors would be addressed, but now we should concentrate on those we are specialists. Are basically, in my case, is the gas sector, where according to the IEA, or International Energy Agency, just tracker, substantial part of those emissions could be addressed, could be abated, so that we have to focus on this and what to do to reduce the emissions in our sectors. Then next, please, in the next slide, could be probably the main one here. We within the UNECE we have developed a document. I think it's a powerful document, the state-of-the-art document, just to address this best practice guidance. Thanks to the EPA from the USA for funded this document that has received contribution from many specialists around our Economic Commission. Then in that document, just for those for people interested, we are analyzing the sources of methane emissions, the MRV, with in a detailed manner. This is for oil and gas sector, right? This complements quite well what we hear about the biogas and biomethane. in this document, apart from the sources and MRV, we include a set of best BATs, the best available techniques, and to mitigate barriers. We also address the barriers, and finally the policy recommendations. And again, this is addressed to 56 member countries with quite a different approach and quite different stage. So that I think for this global audience should have quite interest just to download the document. I include the link, but if not, please just contact me and I will provide the whatever information you need. Next, in the next one, again on information on what is already available. Yes, this is a sample of the a number of documents of reports we have produced in a collaborative way among many initiatives, companies, associations, etc., with very concrete set of let's say reports. I say reports and recommendations. I include here as producers of documents just the methane guiding principles, GIA Marcogas. You mentioned Santiago, that I'm active in several organizations. I'm board member of both GIA Marcogas. Also, there are documents from IPIECA, documents to from target setting. How to for those new for those companies that are new in this field, how to set targets. It's a complete review on what we are doing, and then for those new companies to do the or to start addressing this topic. Then LDAR. The LDAR is absolutely essential to mitigate and to abate, and of course several documents on MRV. On MRV, basically here what I displayed is MRV in the midstream. We are aware that the midstream probably is not the no, probably not. It's not the largest emitter, but every molecule is important. Finally, here, just to mention that is in the sorry, in previous one, please, previous slide. Yes, on the top left-hand side, we have produced an action plan, with several dozens of concrete measures and actions, again available, again from a collaborative approach, and trying to share what we have, and trying to push the companies of our sector to address the topic. In the last slide, I have prepared. Please, next. In the last slide, let me use that slide to share with you that the industry, when we started with this, let's say, activity of raising the awareness, the industry was, or at least the companies I know, probably were not so aware. Let me repeat. And but in the past few years, this has dramatically increased. For instance, in the OGMP, the signatory members of the OGMP, there are around 70 or 75. The majority of the signatory members are from the midstream segment. So that I mean, this has changed dramatically in the past few years, but we need to continue. We need to continue not only to raise the awareness, but also pushing to get this collective goal. Something I repeat, and is, I'm near the end of my of this intervention. What I repeat is that this is collaboration is the key word. Collaboration among all parties. Public-private collaboration, as it is the case within the UNSC, where we are people from companies, also people from member states, from the academia, etc. That we should address the emissions that can be or could be easily and with the fastest results and at the cheapest cost and the lowest cost. So I think that we should do we should start with that. Final comment on the quite concrete activity. We had a couple of weeks here in Spain. Again, a collaboration among associations, stakeholders, just to test technologies to calibrate this and reconcile this top-down and bottom-up. So taste the technologies, and then the results will be available quite soon, just to be shared with the full community, because collective issue and global issue deserves sharing and working together. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and happy to continue and to participate in the Q&A and in the debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Francisco. First we had a presentation by Kait about the biogas sector. Now we just heard Francisco talk about the oil and gas sector. And now I'm going to turn it to David, so we can maybe just have a broader perspective about how all of this methane emissions and plans to cut them are related to NDCs. Please go ahead, David.
Great. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. And thanks to Abt and to the Pathways to 1.5 Pavilion for hosting this conversation. So as you heard from Santiago at the outset, the Global Methane Pledge has really helped galvanize attention in a way I don't think we have seen ever on methane. It's hopefully, I think, a watershed moment for those working on methane. The pledge does have a very strong target. Some had perhaps hoped for stronger, but I think it is quite an ambitious target. But it's a collective target. So it doesn't describe concretely what each of the governments that signed on to the pledge is going to do. And I think our task ahead is really in many ways to concretize the pledge for those 107 countries that are on board, to really work with them and perhaps nudge them in the direction of putting that commitment, that broad commitment, into action on the ground. And as Kait mentioned also, what gets measured gets managed often. And so both in terms of putting that commitment through the pledge into action, and in terms of measurement, NDCs, the national commitments under the Paris Agreement, are quite critically important. So let me, with that as a preface, let me give a bit of data on where we stand, in fact, with methane in the NDCs. And much of this comes from data that you can find on climatewatchdata.org, which is WRI's website, where we have a lot of information in various dimensions on countries' actions, including their NDCs, long-term strategies, and so forth. So far, by our count, it may be like 1 or 2 countries off from the UNFCCC's official count, but by our count, there are now 123 NDC submissions in the current round, the 2020 round, essentially, and those represent 149 countries. And in those NDCs that have been submitted thus far, 97 of them cover methane in their gas coverage. And let me step back for a moment and say that I think there are really 2 dimensions that we should be thinking about in looking at NDCs in terms of how they address methane. And so one is the gas coverage. Does methane appear in the set of gases, in the set of pollutants that the NDC is aimed at addressing, and often that can be just putting it in a basket, right? There's a broad basket of gases that they will cover. So looking at it from that perspective, and I'll come to a different way of looking at it as well. As I was saying, there are 97 of those NDCs thus far, and that represents 123 countries that do have methane covered in their gas coverage. So we're doing fairly well. That's actually up from 80 for those countries that have submitted thus far. That's up from 82 of them in the last round. There are probably about 40 countries now that may still submit updated NDCs, but we'll have to see what happens with those. But in any case, we are seeing fairly wide coverage of methane in the NDCs, and at an increased number that do cover it since the last round of NDCs in 2015. There are a couple of countries that I do want to mention that are notable gaps in that. And one is China, which does not specify coverage of gases in its NDC, either the 2015 version or the updated one. And it also has no top line targets for non-CO2 gases, including methane. The other is India, which also does not, in its 2015 NDC, specify coverage of methane. We don't yet have India's new updated NDC in hand. Prime Minister Modi made some announcements earlier this week, but that is not yet manifested in actual submitted NDC. But I suspect that it will be similar to the 2015 version, which did not. So we're talking about upwards of 30% of global emissions, unfortunately, represented in 2 NDCs that don't, in fact, include methane in their gas coverage. Nonetheless, as I said, we're doing fairly well on that front. Where are we not doing so great? We're not doing so great in terms of NDCs that specify very specific targets on methane. So in the first round, we haven't done some of this number crunching yet for the current round of NDCs, but in the first round, the 2015 round, only 9 of the NDCs had a methane specific quantitative target. And I'll come back in a moment to some examples of that. I think it's going to be a slightly higher number this time, but not a much greater number. In terms of policies and actions, and this is another way in which NDCs can address these issues. In the 2015 set of NDCs, 27 of them addressed agriculture policies and actions involving methane, where they were specific about the methane implications. There were 15 NDCs that addressed waste specifically with specific mention of methane. And then there were 13 across the oil, gas, and coal sectors. So again, not I think a large enough number in many ways, or not what we might have wanted. But I think we do have some good examples of countries that have incorporated specific methane targets into their NDCs, and I think this I think these can really serve as examples for the ways in which countries can go about setting methane reduction targets, whether inside their NDCs or outside them, and also examples for what countries might do as we look ahead to the next round of NDCs. And I don't think it's too soon, by the way, I would note, to be thinking ahead to the next several years in terms of where we might go on NDCs. So some of those examples. Japan, I think, was most noteworthy in having a methane reduction goal that it noted, 26% methane reduction goal. I think that's been in the current NDC, the updated NDC. And that really stands out as an example of an overall methane reduction target. New Zealand has a 10% biogenic methane reduction target, and of course, lots of sheep and cows there. So that is their methane reduction target for 2030. They also have a long-term target for 2050 of a 24 to 47% reduction, and I think are looking at how they can take even stronger action potentially. Uruguay has an interesting target. it's an intensity target, methane intensity target actually. So it's a 30% intensity reduction per unit of beef produced, per kilogram of beef produced. And then I'll last note Nigeria, which in its NDC submitted just within the past few days, has a reduction target for methane, fugitive methane emissions in the oil and gas sector of 60%. There are others that have also have taken similar targets. So those are examples, I think, of the ways in which countries might go about target setting. And I do think, as I was saying, that carrying out the global methane pledge really will depend on countries taking very specific kinds of targets, both economy-wide potentially, but also within specific sectors. And these can serve as examples going forward for NDCs in the future. The last thing I'll note is that just sort of coming back to some of the MRV questions at hand, I think we've seen a lot of headway recently in looking at MRV questions in the oil and gas sector in particular, and Francisco pointed to much of this. And that includes, I think, the rollout of sort of the emphasis of the rollout of the International Methane Emissions Observatory and other efforts. Where we have seen less emphasis, I think, and are going to need to do quite a bit of work is in the agriculture and food sectors. And I think Kait was pointing to this in many ways very helpfully in terms of the kinds of approaches that we may need to take. And so I'll just close by noting that I think there are a lot of opportunities in the agriculture and food sectors for reductions, for methane emission reductions, in addition to what Kait pointed to, lots of opportunity in the rice sector, with rice production, lots of opportunity, I think, going forward with feed additives in the livestock sector. There's still research and development needed, but I think we're really on the cusp of a revolution there. And food loss and waste is another arena. But we are going to have to get the MRV tools right to really know what exactly is playing out with all of that. So with that, let me conclude, and thank you all again.
Thank you, David. So thanks again for those 3 excellent presentations. I'd like to try to dig deeper a little bit into the topics that each of you discussed. And so first of all, I'd like to ask you, Kait, a little bit about, what do you see as the main barriers for getting MRV systems in place? And, to the extent that you're able to share your perspective of not only, from your work maybe in the US, but also in India or other countries, I think it would be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you had asked me that question maybe a year or 2 ago, my answer would have been just attention on the topic. As David mentioned, the methane pledge has galvanized interest in methane emissions, but before this, there wasn't a lot of focus unless you were in this area, in these sectors. And the pledge and just really the news recently leading up to COP, and WRI has a really great publication on methane and other short-lived climate pollutants and how they can contribute to the 1.5 degree Celsius goal. I think that has just galvanized a lot of momentum in these sectors and getting people to pay attention and start asking these kinds of questions. And going on from that, especially in the biogas sector, it's just, again, getting people to sort of pay attention and start realizing that these are important sectors to pay attention to, even though they might not be, the big ones that we've talked about in the past. So we work with partners on the ground in India, and they were showing us some historical emissions data. And so obviously the largest sectors there, energy, industry, what have you, agriculture is another big one. But when we also did a deeper dive with them and they showed us which sectors have emissions increasing more rapidly over the past, I'm going to say like 30 years or so, and waste was the biggest one, which, we assume, but it's also impactful to see it that way in graphical form. And I really just think, when people see that sort of information, it gets them paying attention more and starting to ask more questions about, okay, how do we work in this sector? How do we actually measure these emissions? Because when you look at the information in inventories and NDCs, most countries are using very basic techniques for these sectors right now, making it extremely difficult to have any meaningful conversation about like what are the emissions, and then what are the emissions reductions from these types of technologies that we're trying to utilize in these spaces. So thanks.
Thanks. So let's go over to Madrid again and ask Francisco a similar question. So Francisco, in the oil and gas sector, what do you see as the key barriers to getting these MRV systems in place?
Thanks for the question, Santiago. I would say that the technologies are already available. Of course, everything can be improved, but the important point is that to be used, disseminated. I stress the concept of awareness in my presentation, because probably what is completely necessary is that this is extended to all companies. There are not so few, but many already fully committed companies that are already, I say, applying this from many years now. But this has to be extended to all the companies. Then, what are we doing in this sense among the different initiatives we are active? Trying to teach, trying to produce this dissemination, trying to encourage the companies to do that. Be aware that in this industry, the emissions issue was being addressed, I say from the very beginning, based on or focused on safety, for safety purposes. Now, and second, probably the second goal was commercial purposes, just to reduce the emissions and then to sell that methane. Now, let's say the third and today's focus is the environmental focus. And this environmental focus deserves that the places where big amount of emissions are produced to use those technologies as soon as possible, in such a way that the impact on the environment is quickly observed. Yes, the reduction and the abatement is of the impact is quickly obtained. Thanks, Santiago.
So, David, now let's turn to you. So, we've been talking about the methane pledge, and it's probably an ambitious goal, but it's also interesting that the time frame is relatively short, right? So, from your perspective, are there any sort of low-hanging fruits that countries can take advantage of to deliver some like quick wins and make sure we're starting off on the right track right away?
Yeah. Well, we certainly need to get moving quickly. I do think that in the oil and gas sector, certainly there are quick wins. Those have been pointed out fairly widely, I think, in terms of leak detection, leak repair, and so forth in the oil and gas sector. So I think that is a starting point, and I think that is fairly widely recognized. I do think there are also some opportunities in agriculture and food sectors that may not be as widely understood or recognized, but can in fact get us on the path fairly quickly. So one is, as I mentioned, with rice production, there are techniques involving essentially reducing the amount of water that's used for rice paddies. In rice paddies, alternate wet and drying techniques, dry paddy rice, etc., that both can reduce the methane emissions from rice and also improve the productivity of rice. And this is being rolled out in a number of countries, but hasn't been disseminated as widely as it could be. And I think if you take a look at a country like Vietnam, they've been doing a lot, but also recognize that they need to figure out how to go further, or how do you get an understanding among farmers. And so there's a lot of work that can be done to actually spread the word, essentially. I think livestock is an interesting question. I think we already know that we can improve as Uruguay is intending to do, the methane intensity of livestock production, and that can be done in a number of countries through improved feed, not with fancy new feed techniques, but simply making sure that it's a high quality feed and that the cattle, both dairy and beef actually, are being fed well in a way that improves the amount of food you're getting for the methane emissions and reduces the amount of methane emissions per the amount of food. So that is at hand, and I think in addition to that, we now are seeing a burst in research and development in feed additives. Seaweed, there's some seaweed varieties in particular that seem to provide some real benefits when added to livestock feed in terms of reducing methane emissions. And that research is now moving very quickly. And I think if this is analogous to battery technology, let's say, if you go back not that many years. If we can move that research and development very quickly right now and then deploy what we discover from that research in a very assertive way over the next, let's say, 5 years, I think that can have a considerable impact as well. There are other areas as well, food loss and waste. We know what to do essentially, and it's a matter of deploying it. So I won't go into any further details, but I guess just in sum, in addition to the work that is going on in the oil and gas sector, it is critical that agriculture and food be seen as part of that sort of short-term burst over the next several years.
Okay, thanks, David. So I'm hearing, that one of the things we needed is to have more attention on this topic, and that's happening. There's good technologies available. There's resources, but what else is we needed? I understand coordination is an important issue that many of you have raised. So, Kait, for instance, in terms of the biogas sector, what else is needed in terms of getting more stakeholders to be engaged, to participate in the process? Are there any particular skills or capacities or approaches that are needed, or best practices for government officials to lead this? What are your perspectives?
So yes, I agree with everything that you just said, and I think it's starting to happen. So what I think we need are more resources for people to be able to use. These sectors can be very technical to focus on, and just from my perspective at least. And so, in our research, we've just recently been starting to find information that people can start to use to improve practices in their own country. So for example, we found, I forget the organization that put it out, but a really great guide for countries that have been interested in moving from tier 1 IPCC methodology practices to higher tiers. And in addition, they not only include methods for doing so, but examples from lots of countries that are doing so, which I think is a great resource because people on the ground can then reach out and get much more information from these countries themselves that are implementing. And I think in addition to that, just innovation and creativity is going to be necessary in the sector. We've seen a bunch of interesting examples worldwide. I mentioned the program in Chile that's using blockchain technology. You've mentioned Uruguay a couple of times, and that sparked my memory that they have a program there to register. They have every single livestock in the country registered, which is just fascinating and also so important if you're going to improve your numbers. If you know how many cattle and beef and sheep there are in your country, then you can do much better calculations when it comes to estimating enteric fermentation, methane emissions from manure management. So we just need more creative solutions like that and implementation on the ground.
Okay, thank you. So let's go over to Madrid again. So Francisco, I want to ask you a sort of similar question to also understand your perspective in terms of, how we can engage stakeholders, make sure there's coordination. But I also want to ask something else. I understand in the oil and gas sector, you mentioned technologies are available. It seems many of them are even economically, feasible. They have short payback periods. But even though we still have all those, even though we have all these resources and data, we still don't see a lot of action, or at least not as much as action as we would like. So what else is needed to get stakeholders working in addition to training and education? Is there something else that you think is missing?
Yeah, now it's working. Yes, the stakeholder engagement. Well, there are let's say two ways for that engagement. First is let's say the voluntary, where the companies, just referring exclusively to our sector, companies are start to quickly run to join this club of those who wanted to reduce, to mitigate, to abate. This is something that is ongoing and clearly ongoing. Probably for some other stakeholders, not enough, and some so others even they are asking for legislation, just legislation to frame how companies should address the topic. Then legislation. I mentioned that the European legislation is about to be let's say to proposal about to be published in a few weeks. I know that in Canada, in the US, in Mexico, and in Norway, in other countries, there's already some legislation. I have personally participated in several discussions just in the agency where they bring the legislation just to benchmark legislation and to learn from each other, and then trying to implement, because again, and I will not stop saying that if this is a global issue, has to be addressed globally and by learning from each other. So then, in summary, we have the voluntary, and then we have the legislative proposals, and both of them, by using the current tools, of course, as Kait was saying, the innovation and improvements are already possible, already feasible, but it is not. There is not needed to there's not a need to wait until everything is perfect. With what we have right now, a lot can be done, and then we have to be done, and I believe we are already doing our best, from many of us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And David, what about from your perspective, like in terms of how countries are developing their NDCs or implementing them? Do you see any like good practices or good examples about how maybe a country has been able to engage a broad range of stakeholders to be able to deliver something that is more effective or more credible?
Yeah, well, before answering that, let me just, I would echo what Francisco said about a multi-stakeholder approach. And we're even here going to be convening governments together with private sector actors in the agriculture and food space, because we think that there's a need to start synergizing what the governments and the private sector actors can do. And there are frankly a number of companies in the food and agriculture space that are quite keen on figuring out how they can tackle the methane challenge. I think, I mean, Uruguay is a good example. They've, in fact, they've worked. It's a good example of work across countries, because in fact they've had a bit of work that they've done collaboratively with New Zealand around livestock issues. And they have convened stakeholders there within the country, including farmers, to figure out how to take methane action forward. And that is, you know, what Kait was pointing to in terms of registering the livestock is part of that process. I think we've seen, New Zealand's an interesting example, because it's a touchy political subject. The question of emissions from half of the overall greenhouse gas emissions of New Zealand are from their agriculture sector, and from biogenic methane specifically. And so it's pretty rare in that regard. So it's always a politically touchy question there. But I think they've done a fairly good job, and of course this is an ongoing process of bringing farmers into the mix in terms of working through these issues. And one could argue that the targets are not strong enough, but I do think it's an example where the farmers and the private sector actors have been brought to the table with government to work through how they're going to go about reducing emissions.
Okay, thank you. So let me ask you one last question to it's the same question, but I'd like to get each of your perspectives. We mentioned at the beginning that philanthropists have already committed more than $350 million to support the methane pledge. And then there's obviously other financial players, whether it's multilateral development banks or private investors or others. So, from your perspective, how can we help, or how can we make sure that those financial flows or donations or whatever they are used in the most effective way to achieve the goal? So, from your perspective, how does the financial community and the philanthropic community play a role in this?
So a couple of things here. I think the most important is just the criteria for how to secure financing, like what project developers or others need to come forward with when they're trying to secure any type of money, whether it be from a private financial institution or a philanthropy. Because we've talked with people on the ground who set up these projects expecting, to get some sort of funding, and things change, and it makes it extremely difficult for them to go forward, and then it makes it difficult for the sector to expand. And the other piece of that's just escaped my mind, this is what I was going to talk about. I think, at least in the biogas sector, there needs to be a better understanding of what these projects are. It can be difficult to find funding for them just because philanthropies and banks don't understand the risks involved, and that's not necessarily something that the financial sector needs to. They need to ask for it, or they need to allow us to bring it to them, so that they can really understand the project, so that they have all of the tools available to them when they are on the cusp of funding something.
Okay, thank you. Francisco, what about you? What is your perspective about what was the role of the financial community or the philanthropic community in this?
Well, in addition to again the word awareness and let's say the scholastic approach and bringing everybody on board. In addition to that, because this is probably the most the leveraging way to get the best results. In addition to that, I would refer to probably what could be seen as from a common sense approach is just qualifying and ranking the emissions, and then addressing or just using the money and the funds to address those on the top, and then going to from top to bottom in such a way that the money, the funds, the already limited resources are devoted primarily to the places where the reductions can be produced or can be reduced more quickly. This is what I would suggest to do in the different sectors. I'm not familiar with agriculture or with coal, for instance, but in the gas, I'm familiar. I say that what I would say that why not going first for the super emitters, because there are just a few super emitters, one or two or three of them could mean a similar amount of emissions as, for instance, all the European network together. With a network, transmission network, for instance, so that it may cost millions and millions just to abate a small amount 200,000 kilometers of high pressure pipelines may cost a lot of money, and if that money is put primarily and quickly in the places where these big emissions are produced, the result, the outcome will be very quickly seen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And David?
Yeah, I think this is a critical question. $300 million, for example, is a lot, but it's also going to go very quickly, right? So I do think it's important to lay big bets. And I think one in the oil and gas sector, I think, as Francisco was just suggesting, there are geographies, there are super emitters where laying those big bets is going to be quite critical. And I think beyond that, I think in the agriculture and food sector, so not to be a broken record on this, but I do think that there are some big bets that need to be laid there. And I would probably say that the biggest one at the moment, the most critical one, is with enteric emissions from livestock. And we're not, as I mentioned, we're in this sort of intensive research and development phase in a lot of ways, but I think pushing that as fast as possible and then deploying is going to be very critical over the next few years. Then the other thing I would say is I do think, and the awareness question has come up, I do think that we've reached this watershed moment, but as with a watershed, the water needs to keep moving, right? And so I do think that continuing to enhance awareness and the political salience of methane is going to be an important task, and so we need to not just sort of dive all the way down to the action level, which we need to do, but without also making sure that public awareness and political awareness and the salience is still getting raised. We need to keep putting this on the radar. And the last thing I'll say is that, and this sort of relates to that, I mentioned the two countries earlier that don't have methane covered in their NDCs in terms of their gas coverage or top line targets, China and India. And they are big emitters, and China's emissions are close to a gigaton of methane in CO2 equivalent terms, right? And that's in using the GHG metric over 100 years, the global warming potential over 100 years. If you look at it in 20-year terms, it's, the impact is quite considerable. We've looked at what some of the opportunities in China are. I think there needs to be a really concerted effort there. And then in India, the challenge is that so much of the emissions there are from agriculture and food. And there's a very, it's in some ways the third rail, so to speak, of climate policy in India. But I do think there are important opportunities there. Rice production is one, and I think with livestock as well, feed quality is another one where there can be gains. And so although one has to step carefully and think carefully about how one engages on this in India, I think it needs to be a focus as well.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much for participating in this panel again. It's been really interesting. I think there's reasons for optimism. Hopefully we'll see some quick progress in implementing the pledge. And I wish you to continue learning a lot and engaging in meaningful discussions here at COP26, and we'll see you around.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Santiago, colleagues. Enjoy.